Before we begin, I want you to do something very simple. The next time you see a flat-topped mountain, do not look at it like a mountain. Look at it like you have never seen one before in your life. Look at the top. Flat. Look at the sides. Vertical, ribbed, grooved. Look at the base. Wide, heavy, rooted into the earth. And then ask yourself one question. Why do some mountains look so strangely similar to giant tree stumps? Not metaphorically, not poetically, visually. Because once you notice it, it becomes almost impossible to unsee. Some mountains do not just resemble cliffs or mesas or plateaus. Some of them look uncannily like cut trunks, like something enormous once stood there, like the landscape itself is repeating a pattern we already know from somewhere else. Now, to be clear, this video is not about making extreme claims. It is not about rewriting geology. And it is not about pretending that mountains are literally trees. This is about something more interesting than that. This is about visual evidence, historical imagery, forgotten illustrations, ancient-looking landforms, and the strange fact that, across time, certain mountains have been portrayed, photographed, and perceived in ways that make them look astonishingly tree-like. That is where the mystery begins. Because the deeper you go into old images, old landscape art, and unusual geological formations, the more one thing becomes clear. This is not just a modern internet comparison. People have been drawn to this resemblance for a very long time, and that is what makes it worth paying attention to. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. We are built to compare. We look at clouds and see faces. We look at stars and see hunters, lions, and dragons. We look at rock formations and imagine ruins, towers, and walls. So when someone looks at a massive, flat-topped mountain with vertical striations running down the sides and says, "That looks like a giant tree stump," the important question is not whether that statement is literally true. The important question is, why does that comparison feel so natural? Why does it fit so perfectly? Why does the shape register so quickly in the mind? Because the resemblance is not random. Take a tree stump. It has a broad, flat upper surface, a thick cylindrical body, textured sides, a sense of sudden interruption, as if something once extended upward and is now gone. Now take certain mountains, mesas, buttes, and isolated stone formations. Many of them have those same qualities. A broad, flattened summit, steep walls, vertical weathering lines, a heavy circular or column-like mass emerging from the land. And once those similarities are placed side by side, something unusual happens. The mountain stops looking like just a mountain. It begins to feel like an object, almost like an artifact of scale. And that reaction becomes even stronger when we look at historical imagery. Because in old landscape drawings, engravings, field sketches, and early photographs, these formations often appear even more dramatic than they do today. The angles are lower, the shadows are harsher, the scale is emphasized through tiny human figures, horses or wagons in the foreground, and the landforms themselves rise like silent monoliths from the earth. In those moments, they do not just look old. They look ancient in a different way, not just geologically old, visually old, symbolically old, like remnants of something that belongs to a forgotten visual language. And that is where the phrase hidden historical clues becomes so powerful. Because the clues are not secret documents claiming impossible things. They are visual clues. They are clues hidden in old ways of seeing, in the archives of art, in early expedition imagery, in the exaggerated but sincere impressions of explorers and illustrators trying to represent the natural world before modern media flattened everything into familiar categories. When you look through those images carefully, you start noticing something. Again and again, mountains are rendered in ways that feel less like chaotic rock and more like structured organic forms. Massive trunks, layered surfaces, textured outer walls, a cut top, a vertical body. Of course, geology explains mountain formation through uplift, volcanic activity, erosion, sedimentation, and long natural processes over immense spans of time. That is not in dispute, but what is fascinating is that natural processes can create forms that resemble entirely different things. Nature repeats itself, and that may be the real story here, because once you begin studying the natural world through shape instead of category, similarities start appearing everywhere. River systems resemble branches. Lightning resembles roots. Tree bark resembles cracked earth. Mushroom caps resemble parasols. Coral resembles forests. Canyons resemble veins. Rock layers resemble growth rings. The same basic design logic appears over and over again, in different materials, at different scales. And this might be why the tree and mountain comparison hits people so hard. It feels impossible at first, then obvious, then unsettling. Not because it proves something outrageous, but because it reveals how deeply connected visual patterns can be across the natural world. A mountain is stone, a tree is living wood. And yet, in silhouette, in texture, in structure, in the emotional response they trigger, they can briefly overlap. That overlap is what makes this topic so compelling. Now imagine seeing one of these formations for the first time, not on a screen, but in the 19th century. No drone footage, no satellite maps, no geological documentary explaining exactly what you are looking at. Just open land, atmospheric haze, the silence of distance, and a colossal formation rising out of the earth in front of you. How would you describe it? You would probably reach for the closest visual analogy available. And for some people, that analogy may have been a tree stump. Not because they believed the mountain literally was one, but because the resemblance was too strong to ignore. This is a critical distinction. There is a huge difference between saying, "This looks like that," and saying, "This is that." The first is observation, the second is assertion. This video lives in the first category. It is about observation. It is about asking why certain forms in nature generate the same visual response across different viewers, different time periods, and different kinds of imagery. And once you understand that, the subject becomes much richer. Because now it is not about a simplistic theory. It is about perception. It is about how human beings interpret scale. It is about how historical artwork preserved visual impressions that modern audiences are only now re-examining with fresh eyes. And maybe most importantly, it is about how quickly we stop questioning familiar things. We are taught from childhood to label the world. Mountain, tree, rock, plateau, forest, cliff. And once the label is applied, our curiosity often shuts down. But visual resemblance has a way of breaking those labels apart. It forces us to look longer, to compare, to notice, to ask why. Why does that summit look so precisely cut? Why do those sidewalls look ribbed like wood grain? Why does that isolated formation feel less like a hill and more like a trunk? Why do so many old images intensify that impression instead of reducing it? And why does the emotional effect become stronger when those landforms are shown in sepia tones, archival textures, and vintage compositions? Part of the answer is scale. Scale changes everything. A normal tree stump is familiar, harmless, domestic. A mountain-sized stump, even as a visual analogy, feels mythic. It pushes the imagination into a different register. Suddenly, the ordinary pattern of a cut trunk is being projected onto something so large that the mind struggles to process it comfortably. And that discomfort is powerful. It creates retention, it creates memory, it creates wonder. The shape is familiar, the scale is not. That combination is one of the most effective psychological triggers in visual storytelling, something the brain recognizes, placed at a size the brain does not expect. And that is exactly why these mountain images are so effective. They look like something you know, but far too large. Then there is the issue of isolation. Many of the most striking formations stand alone. They do not disappear into a range. They rise separately, detached, singular, like the remnant of something that once extended further. Again, that does not prove anything extraordinary, but it does intensify the resemblance. A solitary flat-topped formation in open space will almost always feel more object-like than a mountain lost inside a larger chain. It looks less like terrain and more like a structure, less like a background and more like a subject. And this is where historical photography becomes especially powerful, because early photographs often framed landscapes in ways that heightened that effect. The camera sat lower. Exposure times created unusual tonal compression. Distance was exaggerated. Human figures were tiny. The sky felt emptier. The rock felt heavier. Everything in those images contributed to a feeling that these were not just places, but presences. And when the shape itself already echoed a stump or trunk, the impression could become unforgettable. Then there is texture. Texture matters more than most people realize. When you see vertical grooves running down a mountain wall, your brain does not first interpret them scientifically. It interprets them visually. Before you think erosion, you think pattern. Before you think igneous column, you think lines. Before you think weathering, you think surface. And sometimes that surface resembles bark, or grain, or fibrous tearing, or the roughness of a trunk. That moment of resemblance is immediate. Only afterward do explanations arrive. And that order matters, because it explains why people can have such strong reactions to these formations, even when they fully accept standard geology. You do not have to deny science to notice visual strangeness. You only have to look carefully. In fact, the most interesting approach is one that keeps both things in view at the same time. Yes, these are mountains. Yes, geology offers real explanations for their formation. And yes, some of them still look astonishingly like giant trees in certain historical and visual contexts. Those ideas can coexist. And when they do, the topic becomes much more sophisticated. It becomes a study in natural pattern language, a study in how the world repeats form across different materials, a study in how artists, photographers, and viewers across time respond to shape. Because this is not only about mountains, it is also about how we see. How much of reality do we overlook simply because we have already named it? How many astonishing visual echoes are hidden in plain sight because familiarity has made us lazy? What happens when you stop looking at a thing through its official category and start looking at it through form, silhouette, and texture instead? You begin to notice that nature is full of rhymes, mountains and trees, roots and rivers, branches and lightning, canyons and veins, stone columns and timber, layered cliffs and growth rings. The world begins to feel less like a collection of separate objects and more like a single visual language spoken through different materials. And maybe that is why these old images feel so haunting, not because they reveal some final answer, but because they reactivate a question modern people rarely ask. What if the most interesting part of the landscape is not what it is called, but what it looks like? What if resemblance itself is a kind of clue? Not a clue to a forbidden secret, but a clue to the deep design habits of nature and the deep pattern hunger of the human mind. That is enough to make this subject unforgettable. And it is also enough to explain why titles like this work so well, because hidden historical clues make these mountains look like giant trees does not force a conclusion. It does something smarter. It invites the viewer into a perception shift. It says, look again. Look through old images. Look through forgotten visual records. Look at the mountain not as labeled geography, but as pure form. And once you do that, the resemblance becomes difficult to dismiss. Not because it proves the impossible, but because it reveals the unexpected. And that is where true curiosity lives, not in shouting, not in certainty, not in sensational claims that collapse under their own weight, but in quiet visual tension. In the feeling that something familiar has suddenly become strange, in the moment when a mountain stops being a background object and becomes a question. That kind of curiosity lasts longer, it travels further, and it is much more powerful than shock for its own sake. So the next time you see one of these formations, slow down. Do not just glance at it. Study the summit, study the sides, study the grooves, study the silhouette. Ask yourself what it resembles before you ask yourself what it is, because that single change in approach can transform the entire landscape. You may still walk away saying, of course, it is a mountain. But you will also understand why, in old art, old photographs, and modern comparisons, it keeps triggering the same strange thought. It looks like a giant tree. And maybe the real historical clue is not hidden in the rock itself. Maybe it is hidden in repetition, in how often this visual resemblance appears, in how consistently it affects people, in how many different generations, using different tools, seem to arrive at the same reaction. That kind of repetition matters, not as proof of an extreme conclusion, but as proof that the resemblance is real enough to persist. And persistence is what turns a random comparison into a compelling idea. In the end, perhaps the most fascinating question is not whether mountains were ever trees. It is why some mountains make so many people feel, instantly and involuntarily, that they are looking at the remains of something tree-like on a scale that does not seem possible. That question is powerful enough on its own, because it reminds us that wonder does not require certainty. Sometimes all it takes is a visual pattern, an old image, and the willingness to stop accepting the world at first glance. Sometimes the most captivating mysteries begin not with a hidden document or a dramatic discovery, but with a second look at something that has been standing in front of humanity the entire time. A mountain, a shape, a resemblance, a forgotten visual clue. And once you see it, the landscape is never quite the same again.